Okay, afternoon or whatever time it is, wherever you happen to be, and whenever you have chosen to watch this third and final part of what future web historians, I'd like to think, will call the Trust in Science in Turbulent Times trilogy. As with any trilogy, it may not make a whole lot of sense if you weren't with us for parts 1 and part 2. So let's assume most of you were. But for the benefit of those of us joining us for the first time, well, hello, I am Quentin Cooper, I am your host, and Trust in Science in Turbulent Times was originally, and pre-pandemic it's worth saying, the theme for a European Foundation Centre Research Forum conference, originally to have been held exactly 8 months ago today, October the 8th, 2020. But when those self-same turbulent times threw us a COVID curveball and we had to postpone it, these workshops, each exploring a different aspect of the theme, were set up in its stead as a way to sort of keep the conversation going and the debate moving on until it was practical to again meet face to face. So far in webinar 1, we've focused on overcoming knowledge resistance and on the less catchy, but just as important acceleration and digitalization of science production and communication. And for this closing chapter, we are open to openness, particularly open science, but also sharing knowledge, enhancing engagement, increasing participation, generally anything that involves building trust in science by looking outwards to the wider world rather than inwards at ourselves. Of course, that is just my interpretation of the brief. We are very open to other perspectives, and after we've heard from our panelists, I promise to immediately open things up for your questions and comments. Now, I'll introduce those 4 expert panelists in a moment, but first to not only give everyone a proper welcome, but to sum up what we've gleaned and gained from the first 2 sessions and to look ahead to what happens next. Spoiler alert, get your 2022 diaries out if you have them yet. It's my pleasure to hand over to, from our would-be hosts for the original Lisbon conference, the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, trustee José Neves Adelino, and first to the chair of the European Foundation Centre and corporate director of research and health at the Caixa Foundation, Angel Font.
Thank you, Quentin. Thank you. I'm happy also to be here. Thanks to invite me also for this short welcome words. I'm very happy to participate in this session today because I was following the 2 previous ones, and I'm very happy to see what kind of debate you have had. I remember when I read that Mrs. Neal stated in the first session that we don't want more trust, but more intelligent trust or more intelligent mistrust. I was very agree. I agree on that because this is what we need. We need to build better communications in order to fight the battle of this fake news that is inviting all of us. And let me say also, coming from La Caixa Foundation, this is something that we have very interiorized. Let me just say that our founder, 120 years ago, was very precise with a lot of social commitment and with the ethics. In fact, he was a lawyer, but also he was an ethics professor. So all that kind of issues in the Barcelona surroundings of the beginning of the last century was really shocking also in our case. Research and philanthropy has a lot of to say on that field. I think that as we mentioned in other dimensions of the philanthropy work, I think that we can be a good balance between public and private interest, because philanthropy is the safest space to work together for the common good. This is what we define philanthropy, and this is why we are trying to build an organization that will be wider, that will be a greater voice for philanthropy. And as all of you know, that we are really engaged with the idea of Converge, Daphne, and EFC, the European Foundation Centre, and Daphne as the association who also represents national platforms all over Europe. This is why we are trying to do that. And I have to say that probably you are aware of that, we are driving to a good final merge just this summer. So we are very happy also to see that in that idea we are having a good progress. And nothing more. I'm very happy also that we as a La Caixa Foundation, we are really involved in the figure of Nacho Lopez in the research forum. I think it's one of the groups that are more active and that has said a lot of things. They have contributed a lot to the creation of this European community of philanthropy practitioners. And I really think that on behalf of science, on behalf of philanthropy, I have to thank all of you, the work that you have done here. Nothing else. I would like to also warmly welcome José Adelino Neves, that has been introduced also on behalf of Gulbenkian Foundation, just to speak about this research forum conference that will take place next year. José, your turn.
Thank you, Font. Thank you, Quentin. Welcome to you all to this final webinar on the trust in science in turbulent times. I'm speaking from Lisbon, where the sun is shining. I hope the same thing is happening at everybody's homes. And we have been informed that over the next week, we'll have the beginning of the summer with 30+ degrees. So it's just to water your mouth, because I have an announcement at the end. You know what it is, and I hope to see you in Lisbon next year. But anyway, I'm here from the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. As most of you know, we have been created last century, 1960s. And one of our goals is to improve the quality of life through science. We have 4 main topics that we have to dedicate to in accordance to the will of our founder, Calouste Gulbenkian, an Armenian philanthropist. And through science, we attempt to improve the quality of life of people, mostly through an institute that we have, the Gulbenkian Institute for Science in the area of biomedical sciences, where we do research, fundamental research, where we do education. And it's a major commitment, probably the largest commitment of the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. This seminar, as you well know, the main ideas for the seminar come from were identified in 2018, the issues that you mentioned, knowledge resistance, communication, open science, the involvement of the public, of citizens in science, are major topics. These are fantastic times. I don't think that we remember any time when people speak of science and when scientists have had such a fantastic life as in the last couple of years. People are mentioning in the first pages of the newspapers words that they probably didn't know existed 2 years ago, and we are watching and witnessing in our societies with vaccination the immense impact of science in our lives. And foundations can play a major role. And as governments make their decisions, not only as to the level of funding, but also as to the type of science that they decide to fund, and we have witnessing that worldwide, in the United States, in Europe, I think that foundations, the role of foundations as complements to public policy is becoming even larger. And we can have a major contribution in this sector. At least that's the view of the foundation, and I think that most of us probably agree with that. Unfortunately, the meeting that was already mentioned that should have been taken place in October last year, and we were hoping to welcome you all in Lisbon at that time, couldn't take place. We already mentioned it, everybody moved digital, and so the Research Forum also moved digital. We had a series of webinars. That was a way of keeping focus on the topics and continuing the process. And now we expect to meet again next year in April. And we slightly changed the name of the meeting, but we are dealing with, again, major issues. I think we will, summarizing at time, some of the outcomes of these webinars. So all these issues related to how hard it is to recognize truth and how much we have been contaminating public opinion with misinformation and all the issues that have been discussed in the last webinars. And at the same time, we have noticed in our societies huge gaps between the ones who have and the ones who do not have. Inequality has become a major issue in our societies. We are dealing with it in very, very difficult times. The experience of previous pandemics is that it only gets worse afterwards. And so we can expect some troubled times ahead. And science also has a word to say in that area. And the topic that was chosen for the next meeting is the science and inequality. The meeting will be held on the 21st and the 22nd of April of next year, here at the Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon. Again, we are very sorry that we couldn't host you in October last year, but notice this time it's going to be April. And so the weather is likely to be even better. And it will be a really pleasure to have you all with us, to welcome you all. And I hope you can do it in person. We are beginning to be fed up with webinars. So I think it's time to meet again. And I hope we'll be able to do it next year. Thank you so much.
José, thank you. Angel too. So in these vacillating times, that is as near as things get to a firm date. April 21st and 22nd, 2022, Lisbon, theme science and inequality. So there'll be the live on stage version of what I hope these webinars have been a tasty taster for. Now, of course, when I say these webinars have been a tasty taster, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here because we haven't done this one yet. I think we ought to probably get on with it, really. Here are the usual rules of engagement apply. We're going to have our experts. We're going to hear from each of the four in turn briefly, and by briefly I mean no more than 10 minutes each. Then I will open it up for questions and comments. I'm sure I'll have lots to ask of my own, but particularly because this is all about openness and participation, it would seem selfish, odd, contrary, not to go straight to yourselves. Now, for that to work, you're going to have to be able to send in those questions. Now, to do that, and when I say questions, I mean comments, I mean queries for individual speakers or things to put to the whole panel. You can post them anytime through the chat box on Zoom, which you should see right in the center on the bottom of your screen. So if they are for a specific speaker, please do say that, because by the time we get to them, which will be after all four speakers, a little time may have passed and it won't be clear. While we're doing the house, also it would be very useful if you do to say who you are when you're sending the question, and maybe even which organization, foundation, alliance or cabal you happen to be here representing. While we're doing the housekeeping, chat box is also where to go if you're having any technical problems. Send a private message to Marta from EFC, who is our technical support for the session. Marta, I trust you can sort everybody out. Lastly, I should let you know the session is being recorded. If you are interested later, you'll be sent a link to not just this, but all three recordings, so you can catch up on any you might have missed. What will also help with that is if you haven't already done so, please enter your name and also the name of who you represent. Now, to do that, there are again instructions in the chat box, but very briefly, hover your cursor over your name on the participants list, click more or right click on your name and picture, then click on the three dots, which should bring up the rename option. Now, having done that, it will be great if you can keep your cameras on so we can see who's out there, but keep your mic off unless it is you're a speaker and it is your time to speak. All clear? Well, even if not, we're going to go for it anyway. So we're on to our first panelist, and I'm going to keep the introductions very, very short because everybody, I could go on about for ages, but you can all look it up online. She's one of the doyens of science and technology studies, the founder and director of the program on science, technology and society at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and their professor of science and technology studies. Pleasure to welcome Sheila Jasinov.
Thank you, Quentin, and thank you to the organizers of the meeting, Julia, for all your background work. It's really an honor to be speaking in this occasion. I would much have preferred to be in Lisbon, but but this is a great second best. So because of the lack of time, let me go ahead and share my screen and go through a few slides and just make an initial statement, and then we can launch into the conversation that Quentin wants. So as already said, I mean, this is open science and shared knowledge. That's the theme of our meeting. And in a sense, there's a sort of subtext, which is be careful what you wish for. And Angel's initial remark that what we want is not trust, but intelligent skepticism. In a way, a similar thing could be said about openness, that what we want is not just openness, but intelligent openness. And that's the theme that I want to develop in a sense. So openness is on everybody's lips. It's worth remembering that it's in at least American legal and political thinking, a very old idea that's been resurrected over and over again. The Washington Post adopted this subtitle, Democracy Dies in Darkness. Sounds resonant, but the idea that sunlight disinfects politics every bit as much as sunlight is important against illness, that has been around. In American politics, it's often attributed back to a speech by Justice Brandeis in which he juxtaposed, as you see, publicity, political publicity, with the idea of science destroying viruses, actually as disinfectant. So that ideal has been around for a really long time in public life. And it's worth pointing out that openness with regard to science, at least in the United States, and I think in most science-intensive countries, is extremely well entrenched as a legal proposition, as a sort of tacit understanding of what publics are entitled to. And this is a little summary of all the different places where you can say publics, people, have epistemic rights, a right to know and understand the nature of the science and the ways in which science is being aggregated and put out there for public consumption. So one can go through a series of laws, some of them dating back to the late 1960s even, that allow a huge amount of public access. So the first bullet, the right to know, is entrenched in a lot of different places. And, you know, if people have specific questions, I'd be happy to come back to this. We don't really have time for it, but FOIA, even called that, is the Freedom of Information Act. And it remains a very active source of a way of getting behind scientific statements to this day. But the most recent sort of appearance of FOIA in the news that some of you may have followed is to get at Anthony Fauci's emails to his counterpart in China. And that has become, in recent days in America, a source of controversy. What did Tony Fauci know and when did he know it? So one can see that FOIA releases do not necessarily add up to producing trust in science. It depends on the sort of background conditions of skepticism out of which the application of FOIA emerges. So a second point to note that's really important is that we all go around talking about science as if we know what it is. But one thing we've learned over the last 30, 40 years is that science is not a unitary thing. And especially when we're involved in public life, it's far from being a unitary thing. So this is not just about disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, that genomics is different from high energy physics. That's not the point. The point is that when science enters public life, it is in a variety of different ways. And we all know from pandemic times that all these different guises of science rest on different infrastructures of trust and legitimacy. So in the American discourse on science, if you say things like regulatory science, which has been one of my own areas of research, or advocacy science or litigation science, or citizen science, which I'm sure is one of the things that some of my colleagues will be talking about, these all have different meanings, and they have different rules of engagement, different rules of participation. And it's worth asking, when do these different things become science, and how do they become science? So, when one is talking about sunlight and disinfectants, it's well to remind oneself that science gets propagated out of high political places. And one of the sort of ironic invocations of science in the previous administration was this comment of Donald Trump that caused a lot of flurry at that time. But do we consider this to be citizen science? I mean, what do we think of it as? It's worth keeping in mind that science is a big box of stuff, and what is in it is far from evident. And so when we want the public to have access to it, we have to rethink, what is this thing to which we're granting access? So maybe it's worthwhile to talk about accountable science and not open science, that this is more the kind of thing that we're interested in fostering in a democracy. And why is that? Because in a way, for modernity, the sort of central question about the relationship between democracy, the demos, and authority has changed. So we're all used to the idea for a couple of hundred years that for democracy, the question has been, when should the few be empowered to rule for the many? But that side by side and in parallel, we now have a question, when should the few be authorized to know for the many? And this is a matter that has received far less attention, certainly not as a matter of political theory. It's only beginning to be taken on board as something that needs to be studied as part of our assemblage of political theory in the here and now. People talk about post-truth, but in a sense, I would like to talk about it as after truth, because I think truth itself is an idea that whose time has, in a sense, come. We need to look behind it. And I think that part of the shift of discourse that I would like to see in this domain of open science and shared knowledge is a shift from a focus on truth as a shorthand to a focus on public reason. How do we reason about the knowledge that we're generating in ways that come back to these questions of the public good that we've already heard mentioned? And I think there, the question becomes not what is good science, which is still too often the focus of inquiry, but how do people claim to know, and where do those questions come from? So this series of questions, I think, are the ones that, in my view, need to be talked about more, and they need to be talked about in the context of a recognition that science today plays a tacit constitutional role in our democracies, that science exercises power, but by processes that are often unknown and unseen, among other things, because of the public-private relationship that has already been mentioned. And a huge amount of the science today that we deal with is generated in private, behind intellectual property veils and in other ways. That science then operates also according to tacit theories, or what I have called civic epistemologies, in political contexts. And there are different places in each of our polities, wherever we come from, where one can see these tacit theories in play. There are rules of delegation to experts that we don't understand, that we have not put up to systematic examination. I called those rules, in a sense, the fifth branch of government already back in 1990, and that was way before pandemic times, but it's front and center for us to understand today. And therefore, there are ad hoc and unexamined principles of accountability that we need to bring out into the sunlight, that in a way we need openness, not so much about science, but about the ways in which we rely on science and different actors in society rely on science. So I'll just conclude with a very few simple observations about the unquestionable role that private foundations play in this world where science is a very complex phenomenon. It engages with people's lives in highly political ways. And so what is the role of foundations? Well, one thing is to dethrone this idea that science itself should be declaring the norms of society. So one of the areas I work in is genomics and gene editing. And it's interesting that the principles for how publics should engage with this have been developed and declared by the National Academies of Science in a few very prominent places. And so you get statements coming out of these summits that in a way declare what the normative relationship between science and society ought to be. And these are just statements that, you know, themselves we could talk about for hours and hours on end. But it's worth noting that in essence, a constitutional proposition is being put forward here for how humanity should govern itself vis-a-vis life-changing, humanity-changing technologies, and they're being declared in a summit organized by the scientific community. And that is the first sort of state of play where I think we need to rethink, almost reboot our understandings of science and society. How to do that? Well, I've long been arguing that we need a project of another enlightenment, that the first enlightenment may have been about us understanding better our relationship with nature, but now we need to understand our relationship with the ways in which we examine nature. And that requires going back to the content of what it is that foundations support. And we need to get beyond the public communication model. In my world, the discourse has shifted to engagement, which I think is a better word, but the engagement is still seen as too one-sided. It's supposed to be the engagement of publics with science and not of science with publics. And that, I think, is something that needs to be re-examined, the asymmetry of the model that many people operate with. Secondly, the coherence of the project, that do these things hang together? I see many, many interventions by foundations that are oriented to short-term outcomes and impacts and not toward a transformation of the very relationship and the way that we think about it. And then an idea of continuity. I mean, so sitting in academia, I see all kinds of projects that come and go, but they don't have the kind of impact that we need if we're truly interested in this idea of the second enlightenment. And I think we need to invest much more in the kinds of people that are going to populate this 21st century world and beyond, who are not going to be the same people as were around before social media came along and transformed our lives. And these are just all teasers and tasters, Quentin, as you suggested. And with that, I will stop and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Nicely teased. And so lots of things for us to talk about there. New enlightenment, new people of the 21st century, getting away from declarative statements, getting foundations to think longer term. I'm sure there's lots of things people will want to pick up on there. Please do send in your questions and comments. And as I say, we'll get to as many as we can after we've heard from our other speakers. And remember, it's the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Next in our expert quartet, we have Eva Méndez, Chair of the European Open Science Policy Platform, Professor of Library and Information Sciences at UC3M, the Charles III University of Madrid, and many other things. But I think Eva is best summed up by her own description on Twitter: open knowledge militant. I think, I tweet. Sometimes I think more than I tweet, and sometimes I tweet more than I think. Professor Eva Méndez. You're on mute, Eva.
I'm mute. I was in the other screen. Sorry, I'm mute. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I was thinking that Quentin will introduce me like that with my Twitter declaration. I will not tweet to you, I promise. I will just give a very little part of a story that I want to share with you today. I think I can share some slides that will help me to tell you the story about what happened open science in the last 4 years and what is open science now after the COVID-19, where we are recovering the right to science, which is a fundamental right. But of course, after having listening to Sheila, I will not talk about law because I'm not an expert in law, but I think it's a fantastic way to approach the right to science, which is something that really comes out to our story in the COVID-19 situation. Let me tell you a story that starts with this joke, this cartoon, that we were thinking that the subscription of the publications and the publish and perish model will stop in 2017. Then we came with the idea that we will just overcome this model with a goal open access in 2020. Then we realized that we are not going to be there in 2021. Then we talk about 2030 as a new target for open science. But here it comes COVID-19 that put us in a reality of the need of open science, and science is with and for society that is suffering different challenges, and science will make improving the life. And it's also a question that I really became very interested in the next conference that José Neves was announced about science and inequality, because COVID put everybody in the same row. It's equal capability of getting infected, equal danger, equal possibilities, but sometimes science or the access to science make us in an inequality situation, which is something important. But let me remind one of my favorite slides in the last 4 years about the motivators of wills for academics. I always say that the academics or the scientifics, when we do research, we move for grants, for money, for agreements, law, or the particular grant agreement of that we sign something that we are going to do, or by ranking. The journal impact factor is a way to rank in publications. We have millions of rankings of universities and institutions. We rank people, the highest citation that we have in all the time, ranking things around science. But also science has to become by seduction. And in general terms, seductions comes because we have a collaborative team, because we have some researchers that help us, we have infrastructures that make it life easy and very interesting, collaborative systems, virtual research environments. But the funny thing about all this situation that we didn't expect it is that a pandemic became a seduction for science, and became a seduction for science because it became the situation where thinking about open science was the big situation, the big moment for the overcome the coronavirus. And it was in the news in Nature, it was in the many publications in arXiv, UArXiv, etc. Also in the limit of open science save lives, lessons for the COVID-19 pandemic, and also moved the seduction even of the publishers of the scientific business. And we come up with in the 2020, and up in April, all the publishers were opening up the different websites, different information centers, novel coronavirus information centers, etc. But it was kind of open without capital letters. We made a study in half of 2020 that we analyzed different publications of openly available in open access about COVID-19. But it turns out that most of those publications, they weren't not open with an open license. So it was the situation of a particular publication where when you could read the little letters, and it comes that the publication was bronze open access. So you have the publisher has the right to remove that openness again. So it was a fake moment of openness on behalf of the free open access, not the reusable open access. But let me go further on this message, what is happening with the COVID influence on science. And let's go through the message of the OECD when they tell us what is the importance of what are the key messages that we can learn from the COVID pandemic. And one of the key messages is that we have to contribute in open science response with policymakers. The policymakers need to ensure adequate data governance model, interoperable standards, sustainable data sharing agreements, incentives for researchers, sustainable infrastructures, and human and institutional capabilities. But this happened in the policy atmosphere that they have been doing new infrastructures, new pledge, the pledge of the European Commission, and also the declaration of the academies, the World Academies of Sciences and the UNESCO and OECD about the statement of the COVID-19 on the international collaboration of combating the pandemic is the key aspect of opening up knowledge and science, the pledge to sharing on the waiver to share all the data related with the COVID-19, etc. And what we have done is that putting these to work on the well of data. For example, in the context of the RDA, in the RDA community, which is the Research Data Alliance, we were moving forward. We established recommendations for sharing data. We established recommendations for citizens. We have different working groups, and I was particularly in charge of the community participation working group that dealt with all the information that the citizens in a critical situation can provide, farther than the declaration, farther than the acknowledgement, the real acknowledgement of the right to science. That is a fundamental right, but this is the contribution, the seduction again to the community, to the participants, to the people with an app in their own phone, that they are contributing with the data, providing data to make science and to take solutions for the pandemic. So let me just finish with one of my best metaphors. And it's thinking in nowadays when we have these sustainable development goals, with the sustainable development goal 10 things that we cannot leave anybody behind. And with the COVID-19, we have this equality situation, but inequality situation at the same time. Let me tell you that science is like a parachute. If it is not open, it's not going to help us. So that's why I think all these contributions and all this story makes an evolution, a real evolution through openness. I only wish that we don't forget when this nightmare has finished, that we will keep needing science for climatic change, for all the challenges that we are facing in the social activities that we are doing every day, and we need science to have a better world. Thank you very much. I hope we have more interesting discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Eva. And I'm delighted to say some questions are already coming in, which is the idea. So now if you've got questions for Eva, we will, as I say, get to as many as we can. Next and penultimately, we come to Johannes Vogel, a former keeper of botany at the Natural History Museum in the UK, but for, well, almost the last decade, director of the Museum for Natural History, Naturkunde, as best as my German allows, in Berlin, as well as professor of biodiversity and public science at Humboldt University, also, of course, in Berlin. Now, for those interested in Wakapapa, which I learned just yesterday is the Maori word for genealogy, Wakapapa. Johannes's children are direct descendants of Charles Darwin, although telling you that may be taking openness too far. Our third panelist, Johannes Vogel.
Well, thank you, Quentin. So on the theme of Charles Darwin, we are right in. So what you see behind me is the Biodiversity Wall in the Museum für Naturkunde Berlin, and it is basically Darwin's greatest achievement. Darwin's greatest achievement is perhaps not the process of evolution and describing it, but the idea of common descent of all life. He needed that because he had a social agenda. He wanted to demonstrate that slavery is abhorrent and can be scientifically disproven. And for that, you need common descent of all life, including common descent of all humans. And so this wall has about 3,000 specimens, and it attracts a huge amount of audience. I will come to that in a minute. But what happens is that it has a glass in front of it, and so people start to see themselves in nature. And I think that is also a very nice symbol and story about common descent of man and nature. But what is the most important tool in this wall? And you may just about see it. You will see there is no label, not a single label on 3,000 objects. And what happens? What happens is that the most powerful instrument our visitors have comes to the fore, and that is the finger. So when you go to a museum, when you go to any place and you have an inquiry, you normally have lots of written words. And that means who can read fastest has sort of the power. And that is normally, sorry to say, the father. So the father reads what is on the label and then explains to the family what he's just read, which is actually quite boring. It bores the parents, it bores the kids. But if you have no label, then suddenly everybody is equal. And that's when the finger comes out. That is when people talk to each other as equals, because nobody knows what they see there, but they become comparative taxonomists. They run around. You have groups of families or groups of friends in front of this wall for 15, 20 minutes talking with each other about what they experience, what they feel. So we empower our visitors to engage on their terms. Much easier said than done. So the museum in 2007 set out on a journey to become a natural history museum for adults, especially young adults, a very hard to reach group, 16 to 40-year-olds without kids, and now 60% of our visitors. We kept entrance fee and we quadrupled our visitor numbers since 2007. The Natural History Museum in London dropped entrance fee and only tripled their visitor numbers in roughly the same period of time. So keeping entrance fee, but having a real quality offer is probably the way. And we only display our own science. We do explain processes and stories of our science. So all my scientists in the museum can stand in our exhibitions and talk about their work. People talk to people, people develop trust through people. So you need to build organizations, and this is basically my plea. We need organizations to facilitate the second enlightenment. We need organizations that are being trusted, that are open, that are committed to change, committed to be change agents, be conveners and pacemakers. Society has lost a lot of places where communities can convene in a non-commercial space. Every space needs to be commercialized these days. And now even COVID has been commercialized by Zoom and Amazon, as we all know and can read in the pages of the Financial Times. So we need non-commercial spaces. That's number one. Number two, we need to engage with people on their terms. Scientists all too often want to engage with the audience on their terms. That's what we are used to do when we go to scientific conferences. But that is not the normal life people live going to scientific conferences. So removing our authority, making our authority available through audio guides or descriptions in the background is perfectly acceptable. But trying to push it onto people, I think, may not be the right approach in these days. You also need an empowered community internally. Your staff needs to feel empowered if you want to empower externally, and you need to have a culture of argument, a culture of working on finding the right way. So science as a process is, and the science establishment is playing a big role here, is not really understood. The media and also our scientists try to talk about the results of science, not the process. What is risk? What is experiment? What is hypothesis? And how can this be made palatable, understandable for people? This is then when the issue of citizen science or other forms of engagement come in, where we try to practice co-production, co-learning, or even co-unlearning of toxic practices. So all of this we need to do because times have changed. We've heard now enough that the different challenges the world is facing, be it COVID, be it climate change, be it the destruction of biodiversity, requires a different way of bringing partners and actors together. Science had a monopoly on deciding this way for the last perhaps 200 years. I think it needs to change. And funnily enough, science is, in my opinion, not really willing to change that deeply. I may only talk here for German science, where I had the pleasure in the last 10 years to work. It has a lot of advantages, but it also, I think, is falling out of time. So one of the arguments we always hear is, if we want to strive for excellence, we don't have time for engagement. That, unfortunately, or fortunately, is a myth. It's actually not true. So my museum, Natural History Museum in Berlin, is funded through the science stream, and we get evaluated every 7 years on our science. So we are not like the London Natural History Museum, for example, in the cultural stream. And so we have to be measured in terms that every other scientific organization is measured. At the same time, we've really driven up our public engagement. And funnily enough, a vicious circle arose. That means the better we became in engaging with the public, listening to the public, putting on stuff that they want, the better our science became. So it does require a big effort at the beginning, but once you get that spiral going upwards, it actually works. So what has happened? As I said, in 2019, we had 60% of our audience 16 to 40-year-old young adults, which is unheard of in the museum scene. We welcome about 800,000 visitors per year into our museum as a science institution, and all our exhibitions are science-based. That is more than all other scientific organizations in Berlin, and there are hundreds welcome per year. And we engage now 2% of the Berlin adult population in direct dialogue and engagement. And that is already quite a lot of people every year, and they come cumulative. So if we want robust knowledge communities, and we need robust knowledge communities inside and outside of science, if we want to build these, we need to change, we need to learn to listen, we need to become more self-reflective, and all of this requires a lot of money. It needs empowered institutions, and it needs experiments. Just to give you an idea, if you run a good public engagement program, you can bring the costs down per engagement, per visitor, to about, including all costs, $20 per person. If you want to build robust knowledge communities of people outside of science that are able and engaged and willing to continue scientific work at eye level, you are talking about $2,000 to $5,000 per person. But these $2,000 to $5,000 will work cumulative. So the more we invest in new relationship between science and society, the better we will be able to build the communities that help us to get out of the mess we are trying to get into. So look for institutions that are willing to change themselves and then drive change for the system forward, and look at empowering the next generation of scientists. So for example, with the Bosch Foundation, we are now having the Berlin School of Open Science and Public Engagement, where we want to build this next cohort of engaged and open scientists that then can basically make their career through the system. So this is what I recommend, because the status quo is not delivering for the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Fascinating, lots of interesting things to pick up on there, although I did find myself from time to time looking at the things behind you because they're so interesting as well. Now, finally, I said at the start, it is 8 months to the day since the original date for the EFC Research Forum conference in Lisbon. What I didn't mention is that on that occasion, after we unfortunately had to postpone the conference, we did have a one-off webinar on this day. So it neatly brings us full circle that our last panelist, Jacqueline Bruce, was also a speaker back then. Jacqueline is Head of Science Communication and Professor of Innovation and Communication in the Health and Life Sciences at the Athena Institute of the VU University in Amsterdam, and her current research focuses on finding and fine-tuning more effective methodology for responsible research and innovation, none of which explains why she spends a lot of her time in Australia. Professor Jacqueline Bruce.
Thank you very much. Yes. And I remember very well the last time, and one of my main messages when we were talking about trust in science was actually that for gaining trust in science, we needed public participation. And for this webinar series, I would like to actually unpack that public participation a little bit. And it's a rabbit hole. Well, first of all, I would like to go back to the situation in which we see a very changing role of science in society. And one of the main words I would like to pick up on is complexity. Our complex society is seeing many more complex challenges, and science operating in that complex situation is likely to run into unforeseen situations and uncertainties. And that makes science more, a little bit at unease, I would say. And so if we are thinking about communicating about science in such complex situations, then we see two things happening. We see increasingly blurring of boundaries between different sorts of knowledge. And it has to do a lot also with another development, which is the digital revolution, where we see that now with so many additional communication platforms actually taking place, people get knowledge from a wide diversity of sources, also claiming to refer to science. So what is science and what isn't, and what is a fact and what is fiction becomes increasingly complex. We have when science was in a situation where it was in its ivory tower and we only had science communicators talking to the public about the wonders of science, we had a very limited number of actors. What we now see is that there is a multitude of actors that are at the scene to talk about science, have opinions on science, but also about the role of science in solving complex issues and what it can do or what it should do. And science cannot easily more hide behind that they are there for the facts. We now know increasingly that it's a fiction. It's not true that facts are value, ideology, and power free. So it's always, when we talk about science, it's always about values, ideology, and power. We cannot make it into a dichotomy that science will talk about the facts and then society will talk about the values, ideology, and power. It's impossible. And increasingly we see in the debates that science is often more regarded as just another opinion. So there's also a reduction in the authority of science. Was it initially that what was communicated by science was indeed more towards the truth? Now it's just said, well, there are more things to life. We also have experiential knowledge, professional knowledge, and they're all relevant. But of course, there is a lot of value actually in valuing other types of knowledge. At the same time, it complicates discussions and communication. So what we see as within science communication as an extremely important process is sense making, to understand how people and different stakeholders make sense of reality, the complex reality. And they want to understand what's going on here. And what we see is that if people start asking the question, what's going on here, they easily resort to the channels that are closest to them. That's often the social media. So it is impossible as scientists and science communicators to ignore the social media. So it should be taken into the debate, and it should be one of the platforms that science is talked about. And we did research on scientists as communicators on these social platforms, and it's an craft on its own, because there are dynamics going on in on those social platforms that scientists have not been trained in, and many science communicators have not been. It requires new skills, and by the way, a tough skin, an elephant skin, I would say. So the way people make sense about apart from scientific data, it's all about experience, expectations, emotions, values, and interests. So that makes communication, we should include the affective, we should include the emotional, we should include the values. And we should realize that any sense making is constrained and any decision making is constrained. So we cannot easily talk about uncertainty and do as if it is a certainty. Now, in the what we see when we analyze public participation events where communication with the public takes place, we see two main competing ideologies. First of all, we see that we need to inform and educate the public. So we need to misunderstandings need to be tackled by putting out more information. But in many cases, there is this deficit thinking behind it. How well intended this information provision is, you see that it is from the thinking of an expert-driven top-down approach where scientific knowledge is seen as the objective and context and value-free, and anything else that other people might say should not be taken seriously and should be disregarded. Now, public participation in new, as it is, well, I would say a better vision is, well, what we heard the previous speakers talk about a lot also, is about openness. It's about respectful listening and mutual learning. It's about understanding the sense making of the other. And if we understand the sense making of the other, we can go into a conversation, but it should be equal, not in a top-down way. It should be a level playing field. That's the respectful listening and the willingness to learn from each other. So that's much more when we're talking about the dialogue thinking. So participation as deliberation. But what we see a lot about the many dialogues that are being organized, there is no commitment or connection to decision making. So nice things come about, people get novel ideas, they learn from one another. But if you look at what happens afterwards, that's not so much. Often each and every one of the stakeholders go back to their business as usual. So dialogue without action and true collaboration is not going to change science and science in society. So, and if scientists remain isolated in their decision making, then the anticipation of synergies and trade-off, etc., is not going to take place well. They go back to their own situation, and in their own situation, then get into their own one-sided rationality. So truly acknowledging the complex realities of societal problems means that you need to embrace the uncertainty and ambiguity and know that you cannot know. And you need others to understand and make sense of reality. You need the sense making of the other. And that is best done through collaboration, not just communication, but through collaboration. And that means in the creation of spaces for exchange and collaboration and experimentation, joint experimentation. Now then we go into those new Rni approaches actually. So it's not just the business of communication. Then it means we are going to do research and innovation in a different way. We're going to do it much more collaboratively from start to finish, not just sometimes a survey out there, but really collaborate. So then we come to things like responsible research innovation, open science approaches. Now, knowing that is that it requires quite a bit of a change of how we are currently doing research and innovation. So an inclusive, reflexive, and responsive research and innovation practice requires changes in thought and action and organization of the science system, the research and innovation system. And if that's the case, we are actually in for a system change, a transition that's needed. And that's one of the toughest things, because systems are robust and for good reasons. They are resilient to change for good reasons. But they need, then if we want to go and change them, what do we need then? It actually means experimenting at niche level, trying out, so radical experimentation with radically doing research in a different way. And that means that you will have a clash with what we call the current regime, the dominant regime. And we saw already from Eva, what makes researchers tick is often the number of publications, whether they can acquire funding for their research. Now, that's an interesting entry point, I think, for funding organizations, the foundations, because actually funding is extremely important for researchers today. So if you want to help researchers make the move toward more participatory approaches, foundations actually have a very crucial role to play. But actually for that to happen, foundations also need to rethink how they will operate. So they need to rethink how research is commissioned and really take up that role as a kind of innovation broker. And what could they do? I think, first of all, it's very important that they really start working on trying to break the silos. Silos between sectors, between disciplines. And they can do that by really making their research calls more cross-sectoral and mission-oriented. But they can also break the silos by actually setting the research agendas in a more participatory way, engaging a large variety of stakeholders in that process of agenda setting. They can, in their calls for proposals, explicitly ask researchers to use RI, open science, and transdisciplinary approaches. And in their appraisal procedure, also make sure that they assess the relevance of research and the extent to which RI and open science or transdisciplinary approaches are operationalized. Do we really see collaboration in action? And I think, but not just through their calls, because this is very much call oriented, I think that's important for Foundation. I hope that they would like to pick up the role of really going into long-term commitments. Sheila mentioned it as well. So the really long-term thinking of novel funding schemes to realize that, and to help researchers gain competencies in this, because it requires new roles, new capacities, new contracts, let's say. And so if they could play a role in invest in education and training to build capacity, that I think that would really help enormously to also enable researchers to apply in a meaningful way to these calls, and in a genuine way use those methods, new approaches in their research projects. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Right, now, we've only, as is the nature of these things, we've only got about 15 minutes left for your questions and comments. As I promised, we're going to go straight to them. There's a couple of very specific ones for speakers, so we'll pick up on those first. It's also been nice to see that you've actually been kind of talking amongst yourselves in the chat box as well and answering each other's questions. I'm going to start with one for Sheila, and it's from Andrea Saltelli, who is from the Open University Catalunya in Barcelona. He asked, Sheila, aren't you afraid that by using the second Enlightenment narrative, you don't get confused with or seem to be in agreement with that kind of candid brand of positivism associated with Steven Pinker? How about using Renaissance instead, he suggests?
Well, to some extent, I've been talking about this in chat. And no, I mean, the short answer is that I'm not particularly afraid of the words themselves. I mean, to start with, the positivist vision is not just associated with one name or another name. It really goes deep. And to some extent, I was listening to my colleagues on this panel with great interest, because, of course, we all agree about a whole variety of things that would be worthwhile actually creating a compendium of those things that we all agree with. But at the same time, I wonder whether the word science that is at the center of our thinking is not something that's different for each of us, and that is the thing that needs to be interrogated more. So, you know, in Jacqueline's remarks, where I found myself agreeing with 90% of what you said, Jacqueline, but nevertheless, when you start talking about a physicalist model for regime change, I wonder, you know, what world are we straying into, and, you know, what is the scientific model sort of underlying that? And you know, when Johannes, you start talking about co-production, but it's not the same kind of co-production that we discuss in STS, where the very making of the object under study is part of the co-production, and not just a negotiation among people who already agree what the object of study is, and then come together to define certain attributes that they may have disagreed about. So I think that even among ourselves, longtime observers of the scientific and technical enterprise, there are sort of foundational disagreements about what is this beast, you know, what is this elephant that we're all seeing in some partial ways. So I think that, you know, the point is not exactly the choice of words, whether it's Enlightenment or Renaissance. I mean, yes, all of those things are needed, but we need to reinvent ourselves as societies that put knowledge and ignorance in their places, and that there is a heart of darkness inside of science itself. I mean, that is, I think, the thing that many of us want to get at in some sense. And I would love to have those conversations taking place. And they're not happening in universities without a certain amount of intervention from other sources, such as the people in this audience.
I mean, Jacqueline, this is what you were kind of alluding to, not exactly the phrase heart of darkness, but this business that science is always going into the unknown. The unknown can always be made to be scary or complicated. People fear that, and therefore they will seek a path of simplicity sometimes, particularly because to some people the word science itself can just be off-putting. Even if you ask them what they're interested in, they'll go, oh, Grand Prix racing. You say, well, there's science to that. Or soap operas, there's science to that, or materials, there's science to that, but the word science itself can make them go, that's not for me.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, Quinten. I don't think I've anything to add to that. You perfectly
good, and that's fine. I asked my question and answered it myself as well.
Yes.
So the next question here is for Ava, and it is from João Pedro from the Gulbenkian. Open science is equal to free access to science results, ? The system of publication is sustainable without payments from authors, ? Are we creating a publishing mafia, ? Those are all double-edged questions.
Well, I think the publishing mafia was already created in the 17th century. I think what we are trying is to create a new innovative system that allows the science that we need to flourish, absolutely. At the point about the open is exactly the same as free. No, in one of my slides in the study that we tried to analyze the publications about COVID, sometimes you put it something free, but it doesn't mean that it's really open. Openness is dealing with licensing. It's the right to reuse that content. It's the licensing that we do, for example, in Creative Commons. And also there is an open pledge, this pledge that it was led by the Commission last year, is an open pledge licensing, particularly attached to the data that they are going to be used in the COVID-19 research. But also I think there is possible another publication system that gives the society and the citizens and everybody the right to access to the right papers, to the right, I will say, to the right outcomes. We have demonstrated the whole situation that we live with the COVID-19 crisis was that we need science in real time, and we cannot wait for the whole, I will say, dark business of the current publishing system.
Mm.
Sorry, I missed my own unclicking now. I was intrigued by your use of this idea of false openness, and I wondered if there's a sort of parallel there within the early days of the green movement moving into the center. We had green stories in the kind of periphery. Then as they became more important and companies needed to, and organizations needed to be seen as green, we got a lot of greenwashing. Are we now getting to kind of open washing where we say we're open, but we're not?
Yeah. It will be a fake situation because it became, actually I was participating in another discussion last week with colleagues on research data, and they argue to me that the COVID-19 does not make an open science happen. It makes that more, more on the news. This more nice to be open is kind of more that attitude that you mentioned. This sticker of I'm open, but no real openness. And I think it's a bit what happened with the publications.
Thought I heard Jacqueline trying to join in there, but I may have imagined that.
Yeah, no, I would like to add to it. What you often see in practice is that the openness leads to an overload, just to make sure that people really don't have the time to get into it. It's impossible then to go through everything. So it's not meaningful. It cannot be used in any of the dialogues that are taking place.
Johannes.
I think the other thing we should just briefly mention, and as you know, Eva and I work both at this open science policy platform, we have to estimate that to be open and to be transparent, science has to somehow accommodate 15 to 20% extra costs. So that potentially means less science, but therefore transparent and open science, because it's unlikely that the science budgets will indefinitely increase when COVID has to be paid. So science, as we've heard before, is in for a very, very, very deep change. And it needs to address this. And I would make the argument that for public engagement, meaningful public engagement, listening and all this stuff that Jacqueline and others have spoken about, we need to add another 20% of time of scientists as a whole, not for every scientist, but for the system, onto it. But I would argue that's the only way how science can keep its freedom in the medium to long term. The onslaught on science post-COVID will become quite ferocious, and science is not very well prepared to stand up to that, in my opinion, at the moment. And that is because we do not engage our most valuable ally, and that is the broader public.
But how do we deal, Johannes, with the problem that the broader public have got many other things to do? And whereas there are people here who are professionally interested in this and have the time to it, we talk to the public quite often, and they initially they are obviously in favor of this, but we demand too much of them in terms of time, and we end up filtering only. So we end up with the people who are committed, and we are not representative of the wider world.
No, I think science has to learn to lower barriers to entry. And that is not how we would like to enter, but how they want to enter. Yeah, and these are the experiments. And yes, we have to get bloody noses. It is painful to change, and you make mistakes, and you have to learn from it. You have to share that learning. And science is so self-referential at the moment, so well alimented and looked after, that it does not feel the need to change. But that is, in the Red Queen world we are living in, that is not the way to survive.
Good. I like the fact we've had Red Queen references and Joseph Conrad references. We are very nearly out of time, but I think I should bring us back to the question that overhangs all of this. And I know each of you have in your own way touched on it, but I think it's only fair to try and sum up. This is a European Foundation Centre Research Forum. We are focused on the role of foundations. Just a little from each of you on what you think foundations should be doing more of, less of, or differently if they're to be most effective. And we can broaden that out to kind of the general role of philanthropy if you prefer. And can we start with Ava, since you happen to be there looking straight at me?
I'm not sure if I understand your question. I mean,
okay, I did phrase it in that very English multi-clausal way, but what I meant basically,
I don't know what I have to answer
about the role of foundations. What should foundations be doing differently, more of, less of? What shouldn't they be doing? What should they be doing? How can foundations improve what they do in terms of improving trust in science?
I think this is an example. One thing is the promotion of the real science, and you know, because in the times of fake news, we need not only fair science that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We need reliable science. And sometimes we do in the infrastructures and in the policies making layer, we do this fairness or technical approach to science, but we need also a reliable approach to science. And I think this is a huge role from the foundations, that they are really engaged with the trust on science. This is an example, and you can see also the policies that they have been in place, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that they are always the flagship on the openness and stuff like that.
Thank you. Sheila.
Thank you. I want to say two things. One is in answer to your question, but the other is in answer to the things that my colleagues were saying. There's still a kind of deep innocence in this discussion about science. I mean, that is, people to some extent are still thinking Darwin when they think science. And I know that my colleagues are far too sophisticated to really be that way, but we're in a world in which science is everywhere and lots of people are generating it. And the word politics just does not appear side by side with science often enough. There's a profound political economy to the generation of science. And I don't think we're going to get anywhere unless we put words like power and politics and interest and commitment and so forth into the discussion with science. And this is not about a right to science. This is about a right to be people, and how science is distorting, in some sense, our right to be people. I mean, you know, that is a different ball game altogether. As to what the foundations can do, my long experience with foundations is that there is a kind of buzzword fashion of the moment, you know, rush to doing the same things. And this whole idea of public communication, that we fund the things with the highest impact and the visible, measurable outcomes. I think that that thinking needs to be changed. I think that I really like Jacqueline's idea of introducing the idea of regime, but then, for God's sake, let's address the notion of a regime coming out of politics and political thought, and then think how foundations as actors with a great deal of money and therefore power can act in that regime as both actors and change agents. And for that, I think we need a different discussion, a discussion that perhaps is not recorded, and in which people can say more things about what is on their minds. But I think that it's easy enough to look at government funding and see what is not being encouraged. And those are the places where the foundations have a serious role to play.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that Sheila recently co-wrote an article which came out in February. I think we can place a link to it about the role of science or the perceived role of science in the US elections and the dangers of simplistically labeling people as pro and anti-science. So we'll put a link to that somewhere in the chat box. Johannes.
I think all the countries we are talking about, you have very sophisticated research funding agencies that strive for excellence or perceived excellence. So I think the role of foundations should not be to mimic or duplicate the already existing system, but to look for helping science to fundamentally address the change that is needed. So find the change agents, empower and invest in them, and be willing to lose a lot of money, because there is no way that we can chart now where we know already that we are going to get it right. We will get a lot of things wrong, but that is what your money is for if you want deep change, and I think that is required. So rally to that cause instead of funding a little bit more excellence. Others are doing that already in spades.
Thank you. And finally, big finish, Jacqueline.
Thank you. I think based on the last speaker, Johannes, we need to rethink excellence. That's another way of looking at it. And that requires, I think, experimentation from foundations as well, because it is so, if you want to fund research, you want to minimize risk, but you want to minimize short-term risk, in the sense that you want to make sure that the money you put in, that it will lead to a certain result in 4 years' time. And that thinking already is the seed for simplism and goes against any of the more fluid, blurring of boundaries and participatory way of doing research that we would want to happen if we want truly to have science make a difference in the sense of solving many of our big challenges of today. So measurable outputs, predefined based on predefined objectives, realized in a period of 4 years. I think we need to rethink that seriously and go and redefine excellence through an experimentation.
Okay, redefining.
I don't have an answer there, huh? But because we don't know.
Okay, well, that's the nature
of the uncertainty.
Going into the unknown. But I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there, because if there is one thing we have learned from lockdowns, one vital lockdown lesson is that more than 90 minutes on a Zoom can be damaging to your mental health as well. So I'm not going to attempt to sum up, but I think we've covered quite a bit of ground. I've heard a lot of things in these meetings I have not heard before on this subject. And so hopefully there's still lots more to discuss about improving openness and participation, but also different aspects of repairing and shoring and boosting up trust in science and changing perceptions of science and that word science itself. Fortunately, we have a whole European Research Forum biannual conference hosted by the Gulbenkian Foundation to build on what we've done. As was mentioned at the start, the theme is eradicating inequality in science. What is the role of foundations? And a reminder that all of you attending today are invited to be there in Lisbon, 20th, 21st April next year. That, however, is all for this short series of webinars or workshops or whatever you want to call them. My thanks again not only to our excellent speakers for today, Professors Eva Méndez, Jacqueline Bruce, Johannes Vogel and Sheila Jasinov, also to all the other speakers and contributors in all three sessions. Great thanks to the backstage and organising team, including João and Nacho and Marta, but particularly to Julia Lombardi, Thematic Networks Coordinator for the European Foundation Centre. And of course, thanks to all of you for watching, particularly if you sent in comments or questions. That is it. I trust we will meet again face-to-face in Lisbon in 8 months' time. But until then, this open forum is closed. Farewell.